what you see behind that, the title there is actually a bitmap representation of the active game world of Scrabbly. For those who don't know, Scrabbly is a massively multiplayer online crossword game, to avoid overloaded or other terms. So we built this over the course of a weekend for a programming competition, and here to talk about it. So, Scrabbly. We built this for a competition called Node Knockout. For those who don't know, Node is a new platform for server-side application development that's geared towards high concurrency, low latency, and extremely efficient processing. There was a team of 4 of us, Aviel and Damon. You probably know if you follow STS as the 2 guys who founded Untitled Startup. They're a founders co-op company. Rails Jedi is the Twitter handle for Jacques Crocker, who's a local Rails dev, Ruby guy, and all-around good programmer who also happens to be really good at jQuery front-end work. And me. I'm just kind of a guy who likes to organize random people together and make them do things I've never done before. And I know a bit about Ruby and JavaScript along the way. So yeah. So this is Scrabbly. 48 hours, an awful lot of caffeine, probably too little food, and definitely too little sleep later. We came up with, well, here, let's just do the live demo rather than doing that. This. So what you have here is essentially an infinite, or for all intents and purposes infinite, it actually, don't tell anybody, caps out at around 200 million squares on a side. So, you know, if you're really, really into the game, you might hit an edge.
Not 200 million squares, but 200 million in each dimension?
Right, in each dimension,
okay.
Yeah. We tried going larger, but it turns out there's a maxint problem somewhere in Mongo's indexing that it doesn't get very happy with you if you do. So we figured for the first cut, 200 million on the side is probably good. Games are played individually and simultaneously. So when you start playing off of whatever tiles are on the board, but after that you can only build on your own words. And the game runs until you run out of lives. You lose a life by swapping out your tile rack, just like you would in an ordinary word game, for new tiles. Whenever you play on the star square that's in the center of a normal word game board, you get yourself a free life. Otherwise, the rules will be quite familiar to people who like word games. Now, there are some interesting side effects to having everybody play all at once. Number 1 is, unless you can see where other people are playing, you run into the risk of collision, having people steal your square out from under you, things like that. Number 2 is, one of the fun things about playing with a bunch of other people is you run the risk of collision and the possibility of people stealing squares out from under you. To give you an idea of how busy people have been, this is the world state as it was about a day and a half ago. See if you can pick out where exactly we used to start new players.
That's a density map.
The tile density around here is rapidly approaching 1, and we eventually started players after the competition someplace where other people were already actively playing. See if you can pick some of the more enthusiastic players in the game, like, for example, the guy who's made the diagonal stripe of 3x3 words that extends some 400 squares, or the guy who really, really wants to play by himself. This guy is bloating my map size by about 100K every time I generate one because he just insists on expanding out my XY grid.
That's like 1,000 tiles long, right?
It's pretty close, yeah. Thankfully, some other people have come along and made it look a little less lonely for him, but that's because we're starting people where he plays. He doesn't want anything to do with them. So as you're playing the game, you can imagine this was probably a lot more interesting when it was a much smaller space. We'll show you in real time the spaces where other people are playing tiles and when they lay a word. So you can actually see other tiles lighting up on the board in real time as people are playing squares. The game works kind of like you'd expect. So I can play ordinary words, I get a score, my score goes up, I can claim my game, I can tweet it out, you know. Beyond the basic game mechanics, there wasn't a lot we could implement in 48 hours, so some of what you're seeing was added on afterwards. One of the things that we sort of wanted to do when we did this was leave the gameplay mechanics as open-ended as possible, because we didn't really know how people would play massively multiplayer Scrabble on an infinite board. And it turns out there's some interesting game mechanics.
Massively player what?
Massively multiplayer word game.
Ah, okay.
Sorry, I stuttered a little there. Anyway, alright, so that's Scrabbly. So down into the technical stuff a bit. The app's entirely HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript front to back. There is actually a tiny piece that is not, but it's not part of the active game. The map generation happens in Ruby because we're using ImageMagick to take the tile coordinates and produce bitmaps. And ImageMagick integration with JavaScript is not especially good at the moment. So we work in most modern browsers, Safari 4 up, Chrome, well, I don't know what they're up to at this point, 4 plus. IE apparently works in some cases, but not others. Mobile WebKit, don't try and play it on your iPad just yet, because they don't support WebSockets, unfortunately. So, and we make heavy use of WebSockets along with other things. We use a ton of open source. Node's open source. Ryan Dahl, who's working over at Joyent, wrote it, and they're ripping along with that. MongoDB for the back end, which is a schemaless document store database. jQuery for the front end, makes JavaScript so much nicer. And Express is actually a in JavaScript Rails work-alike. It's actually closer to Sinatra than Rails, for those who know the Ruby community. So we got to leverage some awesome services as part of the competition. We're hosted over on Joyent. We have some stuff over on Heroku. MongoHQ is hosting our database. And a company called Pusher is actually doing our message infrastructure. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So how does it work? Front end's a straight up jQuery client-side web app. There's really not a lot fancy going on in there. We're doing some of the sort of standard tricks to minimize downloads. We use Jamit to cram all of our assets down into a small downloadable package. We're making heavy use of CSS sprites to minimize the number of images we use. The back end essentially exports a very simple JSON-based API that the front end clients call into. MongoDB stores all of our game state, the board state, that kind of thing, and browser events are all handled via Pusher and WebSockets. Pusher is actually good enough to handle fallback to Flash-based or long pole connections as necessary. For those who don't know, Node is server-side technology based around Google's V8 JavaScript engine, the same thing that's in Chrome, except it has an asynchronous evented I/O library layered on top, so you can do things like file system calls or network calls in an asynchronous manner. Essentially, there are no threads in Node. There is one context-event execution that runs linearly. Okay, it's not entirely true. On most systems, there are at least a couple of operating system calls that aren't available in a non-blocking form. Node spins a thread off in order to run those, and then gets a callback when the thread joins later. So the practical upshot of this is it's incredibly predictable in terms of memory footprint. It's extremely stable, even at version 0.2, and really, really fast. So just by way of point of reference, at our peak, Node was using roughly 95 megabytes of memory to handle as much traffic as we could throw at it. And right about now, we've dropped off a bit. It's using about 90 megabytes of memory. So it's very, very predictable, which is kind of nice. We've had about 2,000 games claimed. Claiming a game is not signing up for a service, it's not anything, it's just typing in a string at the end of your game. It's a relatively small number, but considering we launched a programming contest, I'm
And how long ago was the contest?
Contest was about 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks, okay. So you've had a small number of people doing a really large amount of human effort in this game.
Yes, we have. We're probably going to break 700,000 tiles sometime at the end of the day tomorrow, and they don't seem to really want to stop. So that's kind of cool.
So that's very cool. So you just need a little bit more PR, and it looks like you've got something pretty addictive here.
I hope so. I hope to make it even more addictive here in the very near future. So.
Cool.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, that was great.